Black Heritage, a history of Afro-Americans. Our current topic, protest and rebellion in the North. Today's subject, the significance of Malcolm X. With C. Eric Lincoln, professor of sociology at Union Theological Seminary, New York. Dr. Lincoln is also the author of Black Muslims in America and 5 other books on minority group relations. Other books by Dr. Lincoln are My Face is Black, and the recently published Is Anybody Listening to Black America? And now, Dr. C. Eric Lincoln.
In the struggle to come to a place where they might enjoy full parity in this country, black people have produced many leaders. They have produced leaders as different as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, as different as Elijah Muhammad and Roy Wilkins. Many people have been concerned that the black community does not follow a single leader, does not speak with a single voice. Of course, there is no reason why it should, because the needs of black people are multiple and manifold, and black people themselves occupy as broad a spectrum as do white people in America. So then, is it so unusual that black people should have leaders who are as different as, let us say, Malcolm X and Whitney Young? Is that so unusual if white people have leaders who are as different as George Wallace and Governor Rockefeller? No, it's really not an unusual phenomenon at all. People produce the kinds of leaders who seem to be necessary to help them to fulfill their needs and aspirations as they see them. One of the leaders who was most responsible for the contemporary Black Revolution was a man whose name was Malcolm X. I first met Malcolm X, perhaps 1956 in Atlanta, Georgia, where he had come on business that had to do with the black Muslims, a group of which he was at that time a member. And subsequently, I did a study on the black Muslims, and I got to know Malcolm X extremely well. I probably owe to him more than to any other person a great debt for helping me to put together the definitive study on the Muslim groups called the Black Muslims in America. Malcolm X was a very fascinating individual. I have often wished that I could have stood in the wings and watched his development from childhood to manhood. It must have been an extremely fascinating experience. Malcolm was born in Nebraska. His father was a follower of Marcus Garvey. When Malcolm was quite young, the family moved to Lansing, Michigan. And shortly thereafter, Malcolm's father was murdered. It appeared to have been a racial murder, and the shock of his father being killed for what he believed in was to have a very important effect upon the life and the ideology of Malcolm X. There in Lansing, the Malcolm X's family, the family name was Little, by the way, was for the most part in very poor circumstances. And after the death of the father, things became very difficult indeed. Malcolm himself, in his efforts to help to keep the family together, to help to make a contribution to the economics of the large family of which he was a part, found himself frequently in difficulty as a boy, so that as soon as he had finished grammar school, Malcolm X left Lansing to go to Boston to live with his sister Ella, who was an older sister by a previous marriage of his father's. Malcolm, as a teenager, spent a year and a half in Boston, doing what teenagers do, learning the ropes, learning how to be hip, learning how to make his way in the streets. It was not unusual at this time, but one can imagine that even then, for anyone who might have had an opportunity to talk with him and to plumb the depths of his thinking, there might have been a clue as to the Malcolm that would eventually emerge. From Boston, Malcolm went to New York City, and he took to the streets of Harlem. And again, he played the role and he followed the leads that were typical in the ghetto of that day and of this day. He was one of those thousands of black individuals who were locked out of the Horatio Alger tradition. The kids in the ghetto weren't going anywhere, and they knew it. And in a society where success is the symbol of a man's worth, one has to develop alternative means. One has to learn to beat the system. And this is what Malcolm X tried to do. He became a hustler. He became a thief. He was known as Big Red. He was a procurer. He did all of the things that he considered necessary to get his hands on some bread, some money, so that he too could exhibit the symbols of success. But the alternative route to success is a hazardous one, and predictably Malcolm X ended up in jail. He was sent to the Charlestown prison out from Boston in Massachusetts. And while in prison, he took stock of himself. It was not to be the last time that there would be a dramatic change in his life. One of the things that he did, in his own words, was to read everything in the prison. It seems that some famous man in Boston had given the prison his library. And according to Malcolm X, he read every book in that gift that was presented to the prison. I can recall Malcolm telling me that when he learned that he didn't know words, that he got Webster's dictionary and began with the letter A and read the dictionary through the letter Z, so that he could master the language that he was later to use so well and so effectively. While he was in prison at Charlestown, Malcolm was introduced to a movement known as the Nation of Islam, the leader of which was Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam, sometimes called the Black Muslims, does a lot of its recruiting in the prisons. So it was not unusual that Malcolm X came under the influence of the movement. And when he was finally freed, he presented himself to Elijah Muhammad in Chicago, and soon after became one of Muhammad's most trusted lieutenants. He organized many, many temples for the black Muslims. As a matter of fact, he told me on one occasion that when he became a Muslim, there were only 6 temples. But at the time that he left the movement, the black Muslim organization stretched from coast to coast, and there were temples in all of the major cities. Malcolm X was eventually assigned to Temple number 7, Muhammad's Mosque number 7, in Harlem, where there is a concentration of black people unequaled anywhere else in America. It was not long before Malcolm X became one of the most powerful voices in Harlem. He could be heard on the street corners, in the mosque, anywhere that people were willing to listen. He became
the Honorable
a man.
Elijah Muhammad and the Muslims who follow him are increasing and are here to stay, and that the only way we will ever get any solution to our problems from the white community is to show a united front.
He was a man who was listened to, sometimes with curiosity, but always with respect, and among black people with a sense of exhilaration. He was one of the first black leaders to use a bit of today's slang to tell it like it is. And in telling it like it is, or like it was, or like he thought it to be, he attracted to him a large following of Muslims and non-Muslims. Malcolm X could be heard and seen across the country, lecturing in the universities, lecturing in the colleges, speaking on radio and TV, debating anyone who was bold enough to debate with him, challenging the black man to get up off his knees and to be a man, challenging the white man to live up to his promises of justice for people in this country. I can recall that perhaps the first public lecture or the first public appearance for Malcolm X, in the sense that there were white people present, or in the sense that it was non-restricted, was a seminar that he addressed at my invitation at Boston University. At that seminar, there were graduate students from Harvard and from Boston and from MIT, and professors in the social sciences from all 3 of those institutions. And the impression that Malcolm X made in that 2-hour seminar certainly provided an insight into the extraordinary abilities of this man and into the probability that he would become a leader to be reckoned with. Malcolm considered Elijah Muhammad to be his mentor. He prefaced almost every phrase with, "Mr. Muhammad teaches us." I have never known a man to give a firmer allegiance to another man than he did to the man whom he credited with rescuing him from a life of crime. And yet, there was to come a day when Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad would go their separate ways. There were many reasons given in the press as to why Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad parted ways, but I have reason to believe that long before the break came, Malcolm was reassessing himself, reassessing his place in the community, reassessing the kind of leadership he felt himself best equipped to give. In short, I suspect that there had entered into Malcolm's mind elements of doubt long before he was finally to strike out on his own. And yet, he maintained his relationship with the black Muslims until he was suspended for having made what was considered to be an intemperate statement at the death of John Kennedy. In any case, when Malcolm broke with Muhammad, he first gave himself over to a period of travel. No doubt this too was a part of the process of rethinking, a part of the process of trying to determine new strategies and perhaps new goals as well. So Malcolm traveled in Asia and in Africa. He went to Ghana, among other places. He traveled in Saudi Arabia. He met and was honored by very many of the dignitaries in the Muslim world of Africa and Asia. He went to Mecca, where he was received as a brother and became, in the process, an Orthodox Muslim, having made his Hajj, as it is called. He was the guest of King Faisal and of other important people in the world of the Muslims in Asia and in Africa. On his return to this country, Malcolm X then founded his own organization. First of all, he founded the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which was intended to provide a spiritual base for the new kind of leadership he now intended to espouse. And later, he was also to found the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was non-sectarian and which provided a continuing base for contact with his followers in the ghetto.
We declare our rank on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
Now that his new organization had been put together, Malcolm set up a headquarters in the Hotel Teresa, which is a landmark in Black Harlem, and which represents a place where he had held many a news conference, where he had held many a meeting, and which was perhaps as much a part of Malcolm's image as any other place in New York's Harlem. When he was assassinated in 1965, he left, as his survivors, a wife, Betty Shabazz, and 6 girls. Betty Shabazz is here in the studio today, and I'd like you to have a chance to know her. Hello, Betty.
How are you? Thank you.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
It has been a very long time since I have had an opportunity to talk with you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask you a question or so about yourself, if I may. And I think the first question that I'd really like to have you comment on is, when you think of your late husband and his work, what is it about him or about his work that is most meaningful to you?
Well, I think one of the things he used to always say was that one of the natural rights of man is to resist oppression. And he felt that the struggle for freedom in this country among the Afro-Americans was a legal one. And he wanted to raise the level of the struggle in this country among Afro-Americans from one of civil rights to one of human rights. And because in civil rights, we are, confined to the borders of, the United States, and everyone wants allies. And in internationalizing the problem to one of human rights, and he did internationalize the problem between Africans and Afro-Americans. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it states that, a man is born free, that all human beings have the same rights and dignities, and that you have the right of education, and the right of a nationality, and the right of a standard of living that will promote health and survival for yourself and your family. So that I feel in this way he contributed. And also he was interested in the school. He felt that since the humanities were already being taught in the schools, but in the history there was very little, if anything, about the Afro-Americans. There was no Afro-American languages, and in the arts there was no African music or dance or literature or philosophy. And he felt that in teaching or in inaugurating in the humanities that are already being taught, these things about the Afro-Americans, that it would give a general knowledge and appreciation of the cultural heritage of the Afro-American.
Thank you very much. There's just one other question I'd like to ask you. We know a great deal about Malcolm's political interests and about his leadership interests, but I was very much impressed by Malcolm as a family man. Would you like to comment on this?
Well, he was a very good father, and I think a wonderful husband.
Very good. Now, you have 6 daughters.
Yes.
What are their names? I can remember the first 2.
Attila, Kubila, Ilyasa, and Gamila Lumumba, Malika Saban, and Malak Saban. The twins were born after Malcolm died.
I see. Now, none of those names sound like the names that I'm most familiar with.
Well, Malcolm named them all except the last 2.
I see. Mm-hmm. And I take it that all of them have African names, is that right?
Yes, yes.
That is very, very interesting. And thank you very much, Betty Shabazz. Mm-hmm. It's a pleasure seeing you again. Mm-hmm. And thank you for being with me on this lecture.
Thank you.
Right. Who was Malcolm X? Malcolm was a man who changed the structure of black thinking. We met Betty Shabazz And Betty carries on in her own way the spirit of Malcolm X. She, like some of the other widows we have come to know, whose husbands have been assassinated,
To know that there are still black people who are interested in the freedom of black people.
Betty Shabazz is a woman of great courage. Unlike the widows of some of our other slain leaders, she carries on despite the fact that the load upon her shoulders must be doubly difficult because she was the wife of a man who was a man of such great responsibility. Malcolm X did not live a long time like Martin Luther King or like Jack Kennedy. He made his mark, and then he was called perhaps to some other shores. And yet he was a man who will have a continuing importance, not only to black people in the ghetto, but to all Americans. We already see that the name of Malcolm X has been enshrined among those people to whom he spoke most meaningfully. There are Malcolm X clubs now among black youth scattered across the country. There are increasing demands for Malcolm X colleges and Malcolm X schools or Malcolm X chairs. There are many black people who hope and expect that eventually the country will honor Malcolm X by declaring his birthday to be a holiday. He's a man who did much to bring pride to black people, pride in their blackness. Malcolm X's spirit lives on in the new black revolution he did so much to initiate.
Black Heritage, a history of Afro-Americans, presented in association with Columbia University. Our current topic, protest and rebellion in the North. Our subject today was the significance of Malcolm X, with C. Eric Lincoln, author and lecturer. Dr. Lincoln is also professor of sociology at Union Theological Seminary in New York.